Dear friends, I gave this presentation on New Year's evening 2023 to an audience quite familiar with the work of Rudolf Steiner, and I am adding this short introduction to provide context for listeners who are not familiar with Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science, and the video is chaptered in case you want to cut to the chase. The lecture by Rudolf Steiner that I am highlighting tonight is Lecture 8 in a cycle known as World History in the Light of Anthroposophy as a Foundation for Knowledge of the Human Spirit. I'm using the English language translation published by the Rudolf Steiner Press in 1977, and page references are to that text. This is, by the way, the translation that you will find online at the Steiner Archive website. There is a newer edition available from Steiner Books with the title World History and the Mysteries in the Light of Anthroposophy. Rudolf Steiner spoke the 9 lectures in this cycle in the evenings during December 24th, 1923 to January 1st, 1924, at the Christmas conference in Dornach for the founding of the General Anthroposophical Society. This important event occurred in a humble carpentry workshop adjacent to the ruins of the First Goetheanum. About 800 people were in attendance. The First Goetheanum had burned completely to the ground on New Year's Eve 1922, 1 year prior to the lecture I am discussing. For Rudolf Steiner, for the anthroposophical movement, and for the various anthroposophical societies and members, 1923 began as a year of grave existential crisis and self-questioning, and the crisis deepened. For much of 1923, following the fiery disaster on New Year's Eve, Rudolf Steiner had not known what steps to take. He busied himself in 1923 with trips to the various European anthroposophical societies to assess the depth and nature of the crisis. And although he insisted publicly that the movement would rebuild the Goetheanum, well, privately he expressed a contrary opinion to his closest co-workers. His mood steadily darkened. He privately admitted that he saw no reason to rebuild given the extreme social dysfunction of the various anthroposophical societies. He did not perceive a way forward. Now, please remember, Rudolf Steiner had never been a member of any of the various anthroposophical societies. He had never held an executive or administrative position. In fact, he had said that an administrative function was incompatible with the mission of a spiritual teacher, and he referred to this as a spiritual law, in fact. For that reason, he affiliated with the anthroposophical societies as a teacher, but he had nothing to do with organizational matters. Now, of course, his opinions carried a lot of weight. But remember, there were other strong personalities with different opinions, and there were strong personal rivalries and jealousies, turf battles among the members, including tensions between the so-called older members and the so-called younger members, or the youth, as old folks like to say so fondly. Steiner pointed to these dramatic conflicts when he said after the fire that the membership had failed to protect the Goetheanum. So, in a certain sense, one might argue that Rudolf Steiner blamed the membership for the disaster, for failing him in their role and responsibilities. It was a fraught situation. The fire was apparently sparked as a criminal act by an outside arsonist who was an enemy of the movement and Rudolf Steiner. Now, there were many such enemies at the time. Rudolf Steiner could no longer lecture in Germany for fear of violence. Anthroposophy had become notorious in the popular press. And keep in mind as well that this drama in Dornach is occurring as Germany lurches toward fascism, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. But then, unexpectedly, acting on inspirations received during a trip to England and Wales that occurred in August and September 1923. A trip, by the way, during which Rudolf Steiner hiked to various megalithic Celtic sites in Britain, and in conversation and partnership with his co-worker, Dr. Ita Wegman, a Dutch woman born in Indonesia, who is very important at this time. But as I said, unexpectedly, Rudolf Steiner resolved to take matters into his own hands and to reform the various anthroposophical societies into one general anthroposophical society under his direction. And having made this resolution in autumn 1923, he acted quickly and decisively. At the Christmas conference in 1923, Rudolf Steiner spoke for the first time the Foundation Stone meditation as an expression of a new resolve, new initiative, and new ideal. He gave this verse meditation as a transformation of the physical foundation stone that he had set into the ground on the hill in Dornach at a very stormy ceremony, weather-wise, in September 1913, when construction of the First Goetheanum began. He drafted statutes for the new General Society. He appointed an executive council of trusted colleagues to assist him directly, and he resolved to establish the School for Spiritual Science under his guidance and inspiration as the spiritual center of the new General Society. Now, this School for Spiritual Science was conceived as a university with contemplative practice at its heart, with various departments or sections raying out from that contemplative heart into the wider world. One of these departments or sections is the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities. World history in the light of anthroposophy may ring a bit strangely in the ears of persons in our 21st century. Why does the title, for example, refer to world history when the viewpoint is predominantly Eurocentric? Well, that is indeed one important question among others, but it is not my intention tonight to speak to such questions. This video focuses narrowly on the contents of Lecture 8 of the cycle, and I will unpack this lecture from a literary and rhetorical point of view. My presentation consists of two parts. First, I will give a summary overview of Lecture 8. Second, I'll provide a brief commentary. The first part of my talk is more objective. The second part is more literary critical and interpretive. Okay, now let's begin. Everyone listening to Rudolf Steiner on New Year's Eve, 1923, had come to that lecture with a deep feeling of sadness for the tragedy that had happened just a year earlier on that exact evening. And their teacher, Rudolf Steiner, despite having promised to continue the topic he had started the previous evening in Lecture 7, where he talked about albumin, he unexpectedly shifts focus. He acknowledges their soul mood right away. He says, "Dear friends, we stand today under the sign of painful memory." He immediately refers to the lecture that he gave exactly 1 year earlier, not to the lecture of the previous day. In other words, he refers to the last lecture to be spoken in the First Goetheanum, for, as he says, just 1 hour after the end of that lecture, the fire was discovered. The Dornach world completely changed. He tells his audience that the present lecture, that is Lecture 8 in the cycle we are studying, is a continuation of the lecture given 1 year ago on the tragic night of the fire. So what lecture is that 1 year ago? Well, it is the concluding lecture in the cycle that in English has the title Man and the World of the Stars. That earlier lecture, given on the night of the fire, has the title in English, Spiritual Knowledge is a True Communion, the Beginning of a Cosmic Cult Suitable for Men of the Present Age. Now, just a quick note. I'm not going to make any attempt tonight to alter the gendered language choices in these older translations. So, significantly, if you look at that lecture given 1 year earlier on the tragic night of the fire, Rudolf Steiner concluded that lecture with a reference to graves. He says, in the lecture given on the night of the fire, quote, "One of the poems recited this afternoon began with the words, 'Every year finds new graves.' That is profoundly true," he says. But equally true is that every year finds new cradles, end quote. So with this mention of the lecture given 1 year earlier, Rudolf Steiner makes reference to death and birth, endings and beginnings, cradles and graves. In other words, he references the phoenix mysteries of dying and becoming, to use a phrase from Goethe. He speaks under the sign of the phoenix that evening. He then adverts to a reminder of the purpose of the mysteries and the purpose of mystery sites, such as the Temple of Ephesus and the ruined First Goetheanum, places where mystery wisdom was cultivated and imparted. He says, "In the places of the mysteries, gods met with men. The world depends on what takes place between gods and men in the sacred mysteries." But then he shifts. After yet one more reminder of the burning of the temple at Ephesus, Rudolf Steiner introduces something startling and new. He calls it a word, but it actually is a phrase, at least in English, and a phrase that he has not used previously in this lecture cycle. It is a word or phrase in resonance with the tragic moment that he and his audience are commemorating on that New Year Eve, 1 year after the fire. What is that phrase? The jealousy of the gods. By speaking this phrase, which he calls a word, he orients the attention of his audience toward ancient Greece, to the time of Greek poetry, Greek tragedy, and Greek mythology. Quote, "Over and over again in human history, we have to hear how a man who strives after the spirit falls victim to a tragic destiny. In olden times, such an event was spoken of as brought about by the jealousy of the gods." And he continues, "The Greeks knew very well that this jealousy of the gods exists. They traced back to it much of what took place in the history of man. With the burning of Ephesus, it was made manifest that further spiritual evolution was only possible if men became conscious that there are gods, that is, supersensible beings, who are jealous of the further advance of man." In fact, Steiner tells us the soul atmosphere of the world in those ancient times, and he refers to the Persian Wars, was filled with the deadly effect and influence of this jealousy of the gods. Quote, "A dark bank of cloud hung in olden time over Greece, Macedonia, Asia Minor, northern Africa, and southern Europe. A dark cloud that is the expression of the jealousy of the gods." Now, to give a sense of the balance and symmetry of this lecture, I'm going to leap ahead to the end of the lecture, to page 137, where Rudolf Steiner introduces another word or phrase that balances the condition that he described as characteristic in ancient times by his use of the phrase jealousy of the gods. In our time of history and soul circumstances, that is, in the time of the consciousness soul, the modern word or phrase that has replaced the ancient word or phrase is now expressed as the jealousy of man. Jealousy of the gods, jealousy of man. Now remember, I have jumped ahead. As Rudolf Steiner closes this lecture, he then paints a vivid picture of the fire and the flames that consumed the First Goetheanum. He says, "A year ago, on New Year's Eve, we beheld the destroying flames. The red glow rose to heaven. Tongues of flame, dark blue and reddish yellow, curled their way up through the general sea of fire. They came from the metal instruments concealed in the Goetheanum. The gigantic sea of fire glowed with all manner of changing colors. And as one gazed into this sea of flame, with its swift lines and tongues of color, one had perforce to read these words, words that spoke pain for the soul. The jealousy of man." These two phrases, jealousy of the gods and jealousy of man, structure his lecture rhetorically and control the symmetry and economy of the lecture's argument. Rudolf Steiner uses the phrases jealousy of the gods and jealousy of human beings to compare and contrast Ephesus and the First Goetheanum. Now, personally, from a literary perspective, I can't help but imagine that this comparison and contrast technique was an attempt to ignite spirit remembrance in those members of the audience who had karmic ties to Ephesus. So, we see Rudolf Steiner creating a balance of contrasts in this lecture and linking to a balance of contrasts in the lecture given a year earlier on the night of the fire. Graves, cradles, Ephesus, Goetheanum, jealousy of gods, jealousy of man. Now, having identified the rhetorical balance of Rudolf Steiner's lecture, I'll move back to the point on page 130 where I digressed. We are again following the chronological development of his ideas. On this page, and keeping in mind the structure of contrasts, Rudolf Steiner again unpacks the meaning and significance of the ancient mysteries, especially the mysteries at Ephesus. And he explains the path of spiritual development that followed in a consequence from the burning of Ephesus, a crime of arson that marked, quote, "the gradual and complete disappearance of the mysteries in their ancient form," unquote. His argument now weaves as a balancing lemniscate between the ancient classical world and the modernist world of Europe in the early 20th century. What are the feature points of that balancing lemniscate? Well, he references the Celtic world of the Hibernian mysteries, and as Peter Selg pointed out in his recent talk, This was a new topic that surprised the long-standing members and pupils. Indeed so. Nobody expected this trip to the Celtic realm of Britain to yield such results. Rudolf Steiner discussed how the path to the spirit in the pre-modern and early modern era, that is to say in the Middle Ages, had an inward character, not an outward character, as it had had in earlier times. Human beings, for example, could no longer walk to a location, to a mystery site, and receive teaching or inspiration by virtue of proximity. The pre-modern and early modern signature, that would be the consciousness soul signature, of the spiritually striving individual, had taken a decisive inward turn. Rudolf Steiner points to the Grail mythology as an example of this inward turn. He then adverts to a discussion of the Rosicrucian instruction characteristic of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. These Rosicrucian adepts were like, quote, hermits of wisdom. Now, that's a wonderful phrase that calls to mind, actually, his characterization of the consciousness soul that he gave in his lecture cycle at Michaelmas that same year, 1923, in Vienna. And that cycle is known as Michael and the Human Gemüt. In this Michaelmas lecture, he characterized consciousness soul individuals as hermits. And I'll quote from that Vienna lecture since it relates so importantly to this Lecture 8 and to the Christmas conference. Quote, if we observe our present relation to nature and to the whole world, and if we compare this with sufficient open-mindedness with that of former times, we find that at bottom man has become a veritable hermit in his attitude toward the cosmic powers. A hermit insofar as he is introduced through his birth into physical existence and has lost the memory of his prenatal life, a memory that at one time was common to all mankind. End quote. He then tells us that these Rosicrucian masters, these hermits of wisdom, were outwardly unremarkable and mostly overlooked, since they were so ordinary and unimpressive, although inwardly they were profound souls. If one had an eye to observe this, one might notice it, he says. But of course, most people could not notice this because, most people only have an eye for glamour and personality, and the more the better. These outwardly unremarkable adepts were, quote, connected in their inner life with the spiritual temples which did indeed exist, albeit the access to them was no less difficult than the access to the Grail, end quote. The instruction of these Rosicrucian masters, says Steiner, was objective and concrete, and probably a bit dry or undramatic, I would suspect, and as Rudolf Steiner implies. There was, for example, no interplay with elastic or inelastic giant statues, for example, as he described in previous lectures. And once a pupil had achieved a capacity to recognize a master, the pupil then could receive a teaching that explained the threefold nature of the human being and how the microcosm of the individual human being accords with the influences of the macrocosm, the anthropos. Now, this teaching was given in the clear light of logic and reason, apparently, like in a schoolroom. You can find this discussion in the middle part of the essay between pages 131 and 134 in the Rudolf Steiner Press edition that I'm using. And as I said, that's the edition that is online. Now, most importantly, this discussion culminates with a discussion of warmth. Rudolf Steiner says, in reference to these Rosicrucian teachings, quote, "The pupil felt how, through the mineral world, he is united with the first hierarchy, and through the water of the earth, united with the second hierarchy, and through the atmosphere of the earth, with the third hierarchy. And it was plain to him that he is an inhabitant of earth purely and solely on account of the element of warmth that he bears within him. In this way, the Rosicrucian pupil came to the perception that the warmth, the physical warmth that he has within him, is what makes him a human being on earth. And he learned increasingly to feel how closely related warmth of soul and warmth of spirit are to physical warmth." End quote. So as you hear plainly, warmth is a key word in this lecture 8. We must not overlook it. And one might argue that this word is perhaps, in a certain respect, the controlling word for the entire lecture cycle. And if I were discussing the entire lecture cycle tonight, I would try to explain that. The word warmth certainly relates directly to the medical work soon to arise, if you're familiar with the history of things. And I'm thinking of the so-called warmth meditation when I say that. You know, Marion presented this meditation at a section meeting just 10 years ago exactly, at this time, when Jane Hippolito was involved with our work. Steiner says, quote, "The moment the pupil of the Rosicrucian teacher perceived this secret of the connection of the element of warmth with his life on earth as earthly man, in that moment he knew how to link the human in him to the spiritual." End quote. And also, quote, "The hard bones, the flowing blood, the airy breath, into none of these do I bring my soul nature, but only into the element of warmth." End quote. Now, this was the essence of the Rosicrucian teaching in those centuries that Rudolf Steiner identifies as the 13th, 14th, and 15th. But gradually, he says, our memory of this teaching became more and more attenuated, and it vanished almost entirely in the so-called crisis of modernity. But as in his opening words of welcome at the beginning of the conference, if you think back and recall what he said in the Harmony of the Hearts presentation, for example, that the American Society made available to everyone during the Holy Nights. If you think back to the opening words of Rudolf Steiner's welcoming speech at the beginning of the conference, in those words, he reminds his audience that in the last third of the 19th century, with the advent of theosophy, and by the way, we should not underestimate theosophy's importance, as we sometimes like to do. He says that at that time, in the last third of the 19th century, the human being began to find a language to speak of these spiritual truths again. Furthermore, says Steiner, that language was given to us, that is to say, given to the members in the room who are listening to him, was given to us in the forms of the Goetheanum that was destroyed by fire a year ago. In the first Goetheanum, we had something that could awaken a memory of the old in an altogether new form. So, once again, the accent tonight is on spirit remembrance, and we've spoken about that quite a bit in our past section meetings, have we not? And the focus is also on an attempt to awaken such remembrance in certain students in the audience, awaken them to a memory of their spiritual karma and destiny. He wanted to fire their enthusiasm to remember, you might say. And I think he spoke to students then and to students now. That is to say, students past, present, and future, actually. Quote, "Whoever looked upon this First Goetheanum with feeling and understanding could find in it a memory of the temple of Ephesus." Well, now the balancing lemniscate of Rudolf Steiner's argument has been woven in completeness. It joins the ancient world and the modern world through the crossing point in the pre-modern and early modern Rosicrucian period, so-called. We now can return to the sea of flame and to the word or phrase, jealousy of man, for we are at the end of the lecture and my summary is almost over. Rudolf Steiner tells us, quote, "For in a manner not at all unlike that which befell Ephesus in earlier time, exactly at the moment in its evolution when the Goetheanum was ready to become the bearer of the renewal of spiritual life, in that very moment was flung into it the burning brand." Now, the remaining part of the lecture that night memorializes the tragic drama of the fire. But in a brief passing remark, Rudolf Steiner significantly mentions that he observed during his last lecture in the First Goetheanum, that would be his last lecture on New Year's Eve, 1922, he observes that, quote, "sponsors were there present at the time, spirits of those who in Middle Ages taught their pupils in the manner I have described to you," end quote. Who would those sponsors be? Namely, Rosicrucians. And we know that those same sponsors, so to speak, were at the Christmas conference, and most likely at this lecture that I am summarizing. Steiner says, quote, "1 hour after the last word had been spoken in that lecture 1 year ago in 1922, I was summoned to the fire at the Goetheanum. At the fire of the Goetheanum, we passed the whole of that New Year night." Next, we have a further poetic elaboration of the night of the fire, and the lecture closes as an anthem and memorial to that tragic event. Rudolf Steiner acknowledges how the members present in the carpentry shack with him received him initially by standing up when the Christmas conference began, as a sign of memory and solidarity. Now the tragedy is fully present once again to those members and to their imaginations. The tragedy is spanned between two controlling words or phrases, as I've said: the jealousy of the gods, the jealousy of the human being. And so, appropriately, Rudolf Steiner tells his listeners to stand up again and to give their fully conscious attention to his words, as though he invoked a prayer. We can read this as a prayer, or as a moment of tragic catharsis, as well as a moment of dedication to future tasks. And just as with the Foundation Stone meditation, the controlling word here is will, or, as we now prefer to say these days, initiative. And here at this point in his lecture, Rudolf Steiner puts great emphasis on the value of individual initiative, on the human will. Now, in the concluding short paragraph of this lecture, Rudolf Steiner uses the word will 6 times in the English translation. He tells his audience to stand up. He says, "My dear friends, you received me by rising in memory of the old Goetheanum. Let us now rise, in token that we pledge ourselves to continue working in the spirit of the Goetheanum, with the best and highest forces that we have within us. So be it. Amen. And we will hold to this our solemn pledge. We will be true to it as long as we are able. We will hold to it with our will, for our will it is that unites these human souls of ours with the souls of the gods. We will remain faithful to the spirit in which, at a certain moment of our life, we first sought the spiritual science of the Goetheanum." Okay, that is the summary of the lecture, and we're almost done. This final part of my presentation is a commentary, as I said, and I will keep it brief. I'll just mention a few important things. From a literary perspective, one of the most significant and influential books written by Aristotle is the Poetics. This book, along with Aristotle's text on rhetoric, which teaches you how to give a speech and structure an argument and how to cope in a civil society without recourse to violence, this book and the Poetics, these are foundational for anyone who aspires to an understanding of the literary arts in a classical sense. One of Aristotle's main topics in the Poetics is tragedy. Now, you've probably read or heard about Aristotle's discussion of tragedy during your education, and you've probably heard about how tragedy is supposed to work. I'd think especially if you were a student in a Waldorf high school, well, I'd strongly suspect that you have heard about this, or if you had a liberal arts education or were an English major, although these last 2 items are becoming as unusual as unicorns these days, eh? Now, 2 key terms in that discussion by Aristotle are catharsis and hamartia. And we all have a general understanding of the old Greek word catharsis. You know, it's become part of popular discourse, and it gets tossed around hither and yon. But the Greek word hamartia is perhaps less well known, unless we give it a popular moniker, tragic flaw, or fatal flaw, as we often hear it. You know, whenever I said tragic flaw in a university classroom, the students quickly came to some sort of understanding of what I meant, and they understood it as the flaw that causes a hero or heroine to crash and burn. But this is a rather naive and mechanical understanding of the Greek word hamartia. It's as if we're talking about an engineering design flaw, like in an aircraft or an automobile, a tragic flaw that causes a piece of complicated machinery to crash and burn. Or, I don't know, maybe we have some genes that need a little snip, snip, snap, snap, and voila, genetic modification saves us from a tragic flaw. But the term hamartia is a bit more complicated and slippery. It also implies a moral dimension, and from a spiritual scientific standpoint, it implies a dimension that touches on matters of karma, destiny and human freedom, ethical responsibility, compassion, conduct, death, and repeated earth lives, among other things. In Lecture 8, Rudolf Steiner uses language in a way that reminds us of classical tragedy. I mentioned his emphasis on the jealousy of gods and the jealousy of man. When he invokes the phrase jealousy of gods, many dramas and literary texts and poems from ancient Greece leap to mind. Some of us even think of the Old Testament, do we not? When Jehovah warns the Hebrews, "Watch out, I am a jealous God. Mind that you behave." But when Rudolf Steiner invokes the phrase jealousy of man, the tragedies of Shakespeare leap to mind, at least to my mind, and I'm sure the minds of others who were familiar with those texts. For example, King Lear or Othello, with those two brilliant villains, Edmund and Iago, for example, whose jealousies and envies bring down the tragic hero. Like a good poet, Rudolf Steiner was attempting that evening to tell a story that would help his audience make sense of the emotions that they felt in consequence of their dramatic experience of the tragic burning of the First Goetheanum. And perhaps for a few of them, he spoke as a poet to help them make sense of their dawning spirit memories of the burning of the Temple of Ephesus. Like a good poet, Rudolf Steiner framed his story as a tragedy, and he surveyed, with his poetic presentation, the scope of tragedy from Greece to Will Shakespeare. Why Will, short for William Shakespeare? Well, I told you already that Rudolf Steiner spoke about the Rosicrucians in Lecture 8. Rudolf Steiner deliberately invokes the Rosicrucians in this lecture along with the Greeks. And I am rather certain that at least some of the members of his audience that night would have heard and remembered Aristotle's discussion of tragedy in Rudolf Steiner's words. Albert Steffen, for example, certainly. They had been educated to hear these things. But the question then arises, who is the hero or heroine to whom this term hamartia might be applied? Is it the ruined and burned building, the First Goetheanum? Is it Rudolf Steiner, Anthroposophia? Or is it perhaps the audience in the room, and the audience perhaps who will read his words in the future? We know quite well that Rudolf Steiner blamed the members and the societies for not protecting the First Goetheanum. And he was so much in distress about the situation of the societies and the membership that he seriously considered walking away and calling it quits. He did keep up a bold public persona, and he made brave statements about rebuilding right after the fire. But he privately admitted to his closest friends and confidants that he saw no purpose in rebuilding, given the tragic flaws of the members of the anthroposophical societies. Now, knowing what we know at this historical vantage point, 100 years after the Christmas conference, is it possible that Rudolf Steiner, speaking as a poet, already perceived multiple possible world lines of karma, plot, character, and destiny for his newly written hero-heroine, the general anthroposophical society? Some of those plots or world lines might in their possible futures veer in a tragic direction. Some of those plots or world lines in their possible futures might veer in other directions. You know, the poetic future is always open and fluid. At any rate, from this vantage point in 2023, we know what happened to our tragic hero-heroine, aka the General Society, only a short time after Rudolf Steiner died. The newly formed General Anthroposophical Society almost immediately began to show signs of social dysfunction. Jealousy and envy held sway. As in the tragedy Hamlet, arguments erupted metaphorically right at the grave and in the grave. Things grew worse and worse. But only a first-year student of literature equates tragedy with doom and gloom. And you know, it's the same with karma. Karma is not a mechanical system of levers and pulleys that hold sway inexorably like an angry or jealous God of the Old Testament. This is not an understanding of karma in harmony with the consciousness soul. At least some might argue that. And likewise, the old Aristotelian term hamartia has a completely different meaning in our age of the consciousness soul, or rather, perhaps it should have, than it did in the time of Aristotle. Rudolf Steiner's Lecture 8 clearly structures itself according to the rhetoric of tragedy. In this lecture, Lecture 8, Rudolf Steiner points to an open question. Will the society that he has just founded at the Christmas conference, will that new society behave like some old-school Greek tragic hero-heroine of the past, subject to the tug-of-wars of karma, as if caught in a contraption of gears and pulleys? Or will it understand the matter far more subtly, poetically, paradoxically, and with a sense of humane humor, as Shakespeare has taught us to do? Well, we know the immediate answer, don't we? But perhaps the drama is only in its opening act. Perhaps our poet is still revising. And who is our poet? Well, good news, bad news. You are the poet who is writing this script. Each of you, individually, from your heart.